Green Talks, podcasty na temat transformacji energetycznej, ESG, ekologii, innowacji i nowych technologii. Warto nas słuchać. Jakie wyzwania stawiają polityce pieniężnej zmiany klimatu? Czy banki centralne zdołają włączyć do swoich działań względy środowiskowe? Jakie działania w tym kierunku podejmuje Europejski Bank Centralny? Czy zielone obligacje to dobry krok dla stabilności rynków finansowych? A także o tym, jak wyglądać będzie przyszłość polityki pieniężnej w Europie. Moim i Państwa dzisiejszym gościem jest profesor Paul De Grauwe, belgijski ekonomista i ekspert z zakresu ekonomii monetarnej, profesor europejskiej ekonomii politycznej w Instytucie Europejskim na London School of Economics. Profesor De Grauwe był wcześniej profesorem Uniwersytetu KE Leuven oraz byłym członkiem Parlamentu Królestwa Belgii. Professor, thank you very much for accepting to do this interview. It's an honor to have you here with us today.
It's a pleasure.
Professor, I wanted to get straight into the topic at hand, which is monetary policy in the era of climate change. Today, we as a society, as economic agents, we collectively face two paradoxical challenges that are born out of the climate change considerations. It's both the change of climate, but it's also the period of transition to a more sustainable economy that in principle is meant to mitigate the effects of the former. And it's becoming increasingly apparent that both might have an impact on macroeconomic indicators, such as economic output, employment, investment levels, which are already impacted by EU legislation dictating the classifying of sustainable activities and investments, things like the EU Green Bond Standard or the EU taxonomy. So by implication, they might prove to be a factor for financial and monetary stability. So having said that, my first question would be, are climate change and its mitigation measures likely to have fundamental implications for the design of monetary regimes? Or do you think that the current monetary paradigm is equipped to deal with them?
Well, I don't think monetary policy has a key role to play to fight climate change. I will explain that in a minute. There are certain areas where monetary policy can help, but it's not a key responsibility of monetary policy or central banks. Central banks are there to maintain price stability and financial stability, right? They cannot solve climate change problems. These have to be tackled by governments, and they have to change relative prices, right? Today, it's still true that many activities that use fossil fuel are profitable, very profitable, right? And as long as these activities remain profitable, finance will flow there. And the central bank can set all kinds of standards for whatever. This will not help. The only way to have a policy that leads us to tackle climate change is for the authorities to use instruments like taxation, CO2 tax on other emission of substances. This is the key, right? So that it changes prices and makes certain activities unprofitable. If coal production remains profitable as it is today, no central bank can do anything about this, right? But it's governments that have to tackle this and make sure that coal production becomes unprofitable by imposing large taxes on this. That is the key insight. Another area in which the government is key is public investment, because during the transition to more sustainable production, great investments will have to be done in infrastructure, energy infrastructure, transmission lines, and what have you. And public investments are key in doing this. So these are the two areas where governments have to act. What is then the role of the central bank? Well, I think the central bank can help in the investment impulse, right? And I've made a proposal whereby the central bank, the European Central Bank, I focused it on the European Central Bank, but it could be done also by other central banks, could do the following. It has now a large stock of government bonds on its balance sheet, right? Several trillion euros, right? It has promised that for a while it will keep this stock of bonds on its balance sheet. In other words, this means that when these bonds come to maturity, it will buy new bonds in the market so as to keep the stock unchanged. Now, what it could do at that moment, it is renewing the bonds, buying new bonds to pay out the old bonds, would be to buy green bonds, right? Green bonds could be issued, for example, by the European Investment Bank or other investment authorities. There are also national investment banks that could finance green projects and issue bonds that you could call them green bonds. And there the ECB could actually buy these bonds instead of buying government bonds. This would be a way to rechannel money towards green bonds that help in our program of creating a sustainable economy. That's where I see that the ECB can play an important role, and other central banks can play an important role.
You've touched upon a number of very important topics. One thing I wanted to relate to now is you've touched upon also green bonds in the green bond sector. So indeed, the monetary and financial institutions have an increasing number of these securities on their balance sheets. Do you think this will impact the risk profile of assets in the financial sector positively? Is it good news for central banks that, in theory, these securities that are meant to be better able to deal with climate change risks that they are on the balance sheets of the financial sector?
Yeah, I think on the whole, this is a redirection of the portfolios of central banks that actually, in the long run, should certainly not increase the risk and may even reduce the risk, because we do know that in the long run, we are going to have to deal with this, and you better hold assets then that are going in the right direction, right? But of course, initially, there's always a great uncertainty, right? What are going to be the projects that are really profitable, that will do something? There is great uncertainty about this. So therefore, the risk profile initially that the central banks now have with their portfolio of assets.
You've also mentioned the fact that central banks probably have more of a secondary role, if any, in the dealing with climate change. And so the ECB announced that it already incorporates climate change factors in for example, in its due diligence procedures for corporate asset purchases. And going forward, it has also said that it plans to adjust the framework that guides purchase allocation to include climate change criteria. And among others, this would be the alignment of issuers with climate change related metrics that are regulated by EU legislation. My question would be then, how do you deem these measures implemented by the ECB?
Well, it's okay. I'm nothing against this, but I'm afraid this will really have only marginal effects for the reasons that I gave earlier. As long as you keep fossil fuel activities, I mean by that activities that use fossil fuels, as long as these remain profitable, finance will flow to these activities, whatever the ECB is doing. And you can't stop that. So I'm not against this, but I'm a little bit afraid nations, right? Institutions that come out and say, we also want to do something for preventing climate change, right? Here we are also among the heroes. Okay, fine. No problem with that. But in order to really fundamentally change the direction, you have to make these activities unprofitable. And the ECB cannot make these unprofitable.
So my next question concerns what you've also touched upon, which are the disincentivizing the use of fossil fuel-based production technologies activity. But given the recent rising energy prices, Isabel Schnabel, for example, the member of the executive board of the European Central Bank, said recently that the transition period to the more sustainable economy will very much lead to a protracted period of higher energy prices. That's exactly because of the rising price of carbon. But the recent hikes were partly caused by the rally in the emissions trading system, as well as the revamping of the energy taxation directive that was done towards the end of last year. So my question would be, do you see these European Green Deal and associated climate policies as perhaps a medium-term factor that forms inflationary pressure? Is it fair to characterize this in this way?
Yeah, but let's put it this way. It certainly will raise inflation as we measure this. And that's not a problem, right? I mean, if inflation is the result of these relative price changes, right? The fact that we raise certain prices, we can live with that, right? We have to make sure that it does not get out of hand. But that is actually an argument to put forward to the ECB and other central bankers that maybe their inflation target is too low. And they now have an inflation target of 2%. If it is true that the necessary energy price increases will lead for a number of years to an inflation rate above 2%, so be it. The central bank should recognize this and should then not try to bring down inflation back to 2%, right? If you say A, you should also say B, right? If you say high energy prices are likely to produce high inflation, then as a central bank, accept this and rethink your inflation target, right? It would not be the right approach to then say, yeah, but if we are at 3%, we have to now bring down the inflation rate to 2%. No, this will be part of the structural transformation, allowing for a higher inflation target of say 3 or 4%. And we can live with that, right? We have lived with inflation rates of 3 or 4% during the post-war period for quite a long time without harm to the economy.
Wouldn't you say that this risks a form of de-anchoring of inflation expectations from the target then, and leading to a scenario, to a price wage spiral that we saw in the 70s? Do you think that's a real possibility? Or do you think that the answer to that would be the rethinking of what the inflation target should be?
That's right. It should lead to a rethinking of the inflation target. I know it's often said, well, the 1970s, yeah, we had inflation rates in many countries exceeding 10% at that time, right? Some countries, UK had 15, 16%. So, yeah, this was excessive, right? But I'm saying, okay, why not go to 3 or 4% instead of 2%, right? And communicate very clearly that this is necessary to allow the transformation to a different type of energy environment, right? Away from fossil fuel. And this necessitates high energy prices. And therefore, we central banks will not fight it. Because that's what you say, huh? You say, on the one hand, you say, okay, higher energy prices will lead to higher inflation. And then next sentence is, but wait a minute, if inflation is above 2%, we will fight it. Now, you can't have this, right? Then you have to accept that, okay, structurally, we are here for a number of years where inflation probably should be a little higher than 2% as a target, right? And we can live with that. We have lived with that for decades, with inflation rates around 4 or 5%.
Steering the question back to more of a purely climate change consideration and how that feeds into monetary policy. Given that climate change risks typically transcend the typical 3 to 5 year medium-term outlook of central banks, which includes the ECB, how do we differentiate and parameterize those risks in a way that will be of utility for prognosis modeling, and that we can ensure is within ECB's mandate-derived policy space?
Well, it's very difficult to parameterize these risks, right? These are risks that have the characteristics of fat tails, the black swan type of risk, right? It's very difficult to quantify that risk. We are used in financial markets to do that, and finance theory has made great advance. But essentially, this has been based on assuming that the distribution of risk is normal distribution of the risk, right? With you know the theory, a bell curve, and plus and one standard deviation around the mean. You have about 66% of the observations there, etc. Right? You know this, and you can give quantitative content to your uncertainty. You can actually quantify the risk, but the risk that we face in climate change is not of that nature, and therefore I'm very skeptical that we can actually quantify this. And what you call parameterize, I interpret it to be, can we quantify this risk? And I'm telling you, we cannot quantify that risk.
So my question...
With scenarios, we know you can develop all kinds of scenarios, extreme cases, what's going to happen if this and this and this. But even that is extremely uncertain because there is always a scenario that you will not have analyzed, right?
Professor, you've mentioned black swans earlier, and I wanted to play off of that and ask you the question, how much is the fact of mounting prediction errors in extrapolating over the long term a problem for modeling and for monetary policy prognoses? Because you've said it's basically a combinatorial explosion. There's so many factors that we cannot account for that it's simply impossible to map this onto policy. So would you say that we just sidestep that question and offer the alternative?
Why we also have to use a precautionary motive, because these really bad things can happen. Let's act now, right? And as much as possible. So that it's not a call to do nothing, right? On the contrary, it's a call to take precautions and maybe on doing too much to fight climate change than doing too little.
What would you say is the reason for ECB's current reluctance to raise interest rates?
Well, it has made two big mistakes in the recent past. Most people don't remember this, but in 2008 and 2011, twice during a recession, the ECB raised the interest rate. In 2008 first, this was in the middle of a recession, but at the same time, there was evidence that inflation was picking up, right? And the ECB raised the interest rate, which was a big mistake because the recession was quite deep. It repeated that mistake in 2011 when we had a second dip, right? A second dip recession in the Eurozone. And again, there was some forecast that inflation would be picking up, and the ECB clamped down and raised the interest rate. So he made two mistakes and has been criticized for this. So he doesn't want to make a third mistake in a little more than 10-year times. So that's my interpretation, why it has been reluctant to act. I think it is going to change now, yeah.
What would then be your prognosis as to the state of the Eurozone in the medium term? Are we in a more dire situation than we were back then in the European debt crisis?
No, I don't think so. We are in a more dire situation. Because, I mean, when you remember 2010, 2012, this was really an existential crisis, right? There were really questions being asked, which country is going to leave the Eurozone? And you had journalists actually making predictions, right? Saying it's going to be in December of this year. I'm just saying 2011 or something, right? Then the country X will leave and the Eurozone will implode. Right? So this was really existential. And that also led Draghi and the ECB to act, right? They were not in suicide mode. And that pushed them to action. So I don't think we are anywhere near this kind of crisis. But this being said, there are certainly risks there also, right? Especially if the interest rates go up. What's going to be the reaction in bond markets of Italy and Greece and a number of other countries, right? Will there be similar fear and panic as we have seen in the period 2010-2012? I hope not. And the ECB has the tools to prevent this, but it must be willing to use these tools, right?
Professor, I think that's the right question to end on. That would be all from my side. Thank you very much for agreeing to have this interview with us. And it was great, and hope to have you for future episodes of the podcast if that would be okay.
Okay, sure. It was a pleasure for me.
Thank you very much. Dziękujemy bardzo Państwu.